We've got Brandon and Brady from Kabuki Strength on the podcast. I took their Kabuki Movement Systems course about a month ago. Found it to be super insightful, super helpful. These guys have basically taken a lot of rehab principles from courses like DNS, which is Dynamic Neuromuscular Stabilization, which I've actually taken a lot of that coursework as well and attempted to apply similar concepts to getting people better in CrossFit. But these guys are approaching it from more of a powerlifting perspective, which, again, kind of seeing this cross-pollination of ideas can give a lot of insight in terms of what is actually best practices for getting people better. In this case, movement, right? So we had some good conversations on Skype just about, how to actually apply this stuff, how to think about taking rehab principles and applying them to a more competitive type of mindset, and then also just getting people to buy into this. Since it's one thing for you as a coach to know it, it's a much different thing to actually get your clients to do what you know is actually in their best interest. We did have some audio issues recording this. Unfortunately, Brady and Brandon run a podcast themselves, but they were locked out of the actual podcast gear that they have on hand. So we kind of threw this thing together, tried to clean it up in post-production. So if you're a podcast audiophile, apologies in advance for torturing your eardrums, but it's not so bad. If you're not on my newsletter yet, what are you doing? Go ahead, get on there. toddneef.com, sign up for that. You'll get all my writing there. Most of it never makes it to the blog. In the meantime, enjoy this conversation with Brady and Brandon.
Yeah, the archetypes are funny. It seems like we usually have like one specific person who tries to take all the movement stuff too far. Like they're afraid to progress anything because they want everything to be 100% perfect and they never get there. And they're always telling themselves stories about these injuries they have and these imbalances, and they're going to just paralyze themselves. Yeah, there's all sorts of different kind of archetypes we run into at seminars.
Yeah, unfortunately, most of them aren't that comedic except from our perspective in us reflecting on them. But yeah, there's hilarity and all.
I think
it's hard enough,
right?
Yeah. I mean, that's actually something that I was going to bring up today that you just mentioned, Brady. The person who's, just terrified of doing anything wrong because you're like, okay, cool. Like there's some optimal positions for your joints or whatever. And they're like, I'm suboptimal. I can never progress. Like, help me. Yeah. What do I do? And I always wonder, like, I assume you guys get the technique trolls on like YouTube videos or Instagram videos or whatever, or like someone's, deadlifting 800 pounds or whatever. And they're like, if you notice their right knee is slightly valgus, like this is a shit show, like disaster, and like, how can we help you, sir? Like, what's going on over there?
Yeah. I don't think Brandon or myself get as many of those. Chris tends to get quite a few, especially for like pulling sumo and stuff, just general internet shit that gets thrown around. Are we allowed to swear on this?
Oh yeah. Let him fly.
Okay, cool. Just make sure. Yeah, so Chris seems to get those a lot, and I think the way that it gets dealt with totally varies. But yeah, there's definitely no shortage of that, where everybody's hypercritical of stuff and they're barely lifting themselves.
Yeah, the majority of the videos that I wouldn't even say involved with, but view, usually my own lifters, and ones that come to mind are like Joe or Bridgeford when I was training him, and both those guys would get criticism of squatting high. That's about the extent of it, though. We don't get a ton of, I don't think we, at least on our videos, we don't. Like our movement videos, I don't think we get a ton of technique type trolls coming in.
Yeah.
Most of our lifters, if like, they're fairly, like we have a fairly unique space in the market where we, we're a powerlifting and strength company, but we really, really bring movement stuff into it. So we kind of bridge those two things. So a lot of our lifters, at least in my experience, they don't post a ton of stuff that's really bad because they kind of know, they self-audit themselves. But yeah, definitely we get the people commenting about high squats, soft locked out deadlifts, etc. Chris gets quite a few, as Brady mentioned, which is always pretty funny. It's people that don't like lift. I mean, when I look at it too, I can definitely understand, because if I wasn't involved in the sport, I'd be like, what are you doing? You clearly don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, and at that point, though, it's like these people never even consider to check themselves and be like, oh, well, this person actually competes in this sport or has competed for decades, and I don't even lift, so maybe I shouldn't voice my opinion. But it's the internet, so everybody feels like they got to throw their hat in the mix.
Well, I don't even think people audit themselves before they speak, especially on the internet. They just kind of, if a thought comes in, it's just kind of, bleh. Okay, it's out there.
Yeah.
No, we don't take it too personally.
Yeah, it seems like women get that way worse anyway, especially in relation to the bench press. Like the arch thing, everybody just gets trashed on for. And then I think women just get it a little more in general too, because there's just a bunch of insecure men that don't even lift out there throwing.
The only thing I ever had was me personally. I had a squat that I took at a local meet, and like the bars slightly rolled up my back, and there's like a handful of USAPL purists. It was like up and down. The bar like rolled up my back. I don't know. We don't get too much of it, but we definitely view it on like out there.
I actually have had that happen once that kind of stands out. This Russian guy really got after me once. I was squatting.
There's no lift.
It wasn't even that. At the time, I was squatting even more like upright, high bar, knees forward than I am right now. And he asked me why I had such a frontal chain dominant anterior squat, and I kind of raised an eyebrow, and I was like, well, this is just how I squat right now. I gave him a polite answer, essentially. And he kept coming back at me. I couldn't get this guy to just leave it alone. He eventually started DMing me, but he's like, why don't you use your posterior chain more? Why don't you use your posterior chain more?
I remember that.
Yeah, and I had to break it down for him about 17 different ways, and finally I was like, dude, I don't know what to tell you. This is just the way that I'm squatting right now. And he was very convinced that he was about to change my life.
Now that I think about it, though, we do actually have a fair bit of that on the website, in the forum. So we have a website dedicated, or like a section of our website dedicated to movement videos, and a forum where people can ask questions, etc. And inevitably on the forum, people they come in and they post their videos, but it's always with their preconceived, like what they've defined as their causes and their problems, etc. And it's usually it's in the ballpark, but it's like our biggest struggle there is just finding a way to communicate with them, because normally it's almost like we're speaking a different language. So that's about the extent of it, though, I'd say.
And that's actually something that I think is probably pretty interesting, because I'll get the same thing from people sometimes, where they'll sort of be like, yeah, so, when I snatch, my right shoulder doesn't lock out, and like I know that my, scapular stabilizers are weak on the left side, and my left hip impinges, so I'm like definitely rotating, and, I just really need to figure out how to like get, better scapular stability. And I'm like, whoa, like, hold on, like, where did you get all this, right? And like, maybe you're right, but like, you've gone pretty far down this rabbit hole, just like based on, like voodoo and like, I don't know, like tarot cards or something. Where are you at? Where are you coming from? So how do you guys help people who are coming in like hot like that?
Brandon and I will often joke that the more anatomical terms somebody throws into a thing like a dialogue like that, the less they probably understand, and they're probably really trying to pigeonhole their problem. The body just doesn't work in isolation that much, almost ever. Usually fixing those kinds of problems start with just having a conversation that it's probably not as bad as it seems to be. And I mean, you used like a snatch example of like not locking out their right arm. A lot of the time you just got to cue the person to do that more, or take the weight down to a point where they can demonstrate technical proficiency and then build it up from there. But again, a lot of it has to be structured around just telling them that like you don't have this litany of problems that's driving one after another. You don't need to foam roll for 45 minutes to try and chase them. You don't need 17 different activation drills before your lift. You just need to start focusing. You need to be mindful and aware during the lift and lift better.
Yeah, that's honestly the biggest struggle as a coach, I think, is it's almost like unwinding that person's thought process. Because as Brady mentioned, it's usually, if that was the cause, because those people are usually ultra specific, like they would have already fixed it. Like if you know that this very, very specific thing is your cause, then like, okay, it becomes very simple at that point. Albeit, putting it into practice a little harder and being practical with it. But I think for us, the hardest thing with that is really getting buy-in, because we are, we're not physical therapists here, and I think, we're not movement practitioners in any sense. So I think we often have people who come to us wanting us to like rehab them. We're like, no, we can't really do that. So talking to them how, what we do is based off movement principles, and, working through our priorities first and then doing all the other stuff is usually a tough conversation to have. Because even if we're like, okay, this person is clearly like they can't brace, they can't stabilize their pelvis, they can't, their rib cage is a mess. And we see it when they squat, their shoulders elevate and their scapula elevate when they take air in, and then they go into a massive pelvic tilt. And we're like, hey, let's work on repatterning your breathing and bracing. They're like, okay, now what do I do about all of these other issues? I was like, no, that is the issue. So that's really the hardest thing about that for us. Usually if people can let go of the story they're telling themselves, they're usually quite a bit more effective.
Yeah, we definitely do focus a lot around movement because everybody thinks that we're the go-to people for these super obscure problems, even though that's generally not the problem. Like we're pretty good at it. We kind of pride ourselves in being able to see those upstream, so to speak, dysfunctions and then correcting them at that point.
Yeah, it's an honest effort from those people too. In my experience, a lot of the people who come with those ultra specific problems, they hear it from like a chiropractor or a massage therapist is the worst one. They'll come from their massage therapist. It's like, oh yeah, it hurt when I squeeze your left erector. Oh, it's okay. It's your serratus or something. Who knows? Those are the hardest ones because we kind of have to be very selective with how we talk to them because we can't be combative with the person that told them that. We just have to, slowly ease our way in. But those are always very challenging. It really helps for people who want to be coached to be coached, and kind of let go of all that other stuff.
All the time in those kinds of situations, I try very hard to not overstep any kind of medical practitioner, despite how ridiculous some of the things some of them might say are. But rather than even trying to unwind the story at that point, you could say, oh, well, that's interesting, but let's try this other thing really quick and see if it does anything for you. And then you can start to get buy-in that way without speaking against what the other person was saying, but just providing kind of an alternative route.
Yeah, which we see a lot too with less secure coaches, I would say, or novice coaches. Their way of getting buy-in is combatively with what other people have said. So to get their point across, someone will say, oh, 5x5 is the best program. As a reasonable coach who's been doing this, or even a reasonable lifter, we know that's probably not an accurate statement. It's not that it's bad, but it's probably not the best. And what we see from newer or less secure coaches is a very combative towards that. They're like, no, it's idiotic. It couldn't possibly be right. Here, this is right. It's always combative followed by a solution that's their solution.
And once you've exhausted your 2 or 3 regular options, you don't really have any options other than to just get offended and be insecure about your lack of ability to deal with whatever the problem that's presenting is. You just have to go back to your 2 or 3 normal things that you would do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, coaches, like you said, who are maybe less secure or less experienced are much more dogmatic about things simply because they don't have the frame of reference of understanding, why the guru who they subscribe to potentially said something. Right, that I actually think we potentially talked about this, at the course in Chicago recently, where it's like Gray Cook acolytes will despise Stu McGill acolytes, and it's like, well, actually, Gray Cook and Stu McGill probably agree with each other most of the time, and they definitely don't agree on everything, but they're on the same page. Whereas, if you take that down a few steps in the family tree to someone who, doesn't fully understand the concepts that they're discussing, that these people are much more dogmatic and combative about ideas simply because they don't have the full frame of reference.
That's completely true. It's kind of like if you ever played that telephone game as a child, like in school or something, where you get a line of 20 kids and you start with a word on this end and it comes out on the other end as completely different. I mean, that's what it's like in real life, and we found that to be true too. People who we thought we didn't necessarily agree with, we meet them in person and we're like, oh, you're a good dude. So I think the internet kind of sucks for that, honestly. People in general in person are usually pretty cool, and it's just hard to get full communication out over internet or inferring from past discussions when you're looking on as a third party.
Yeah, it's just really hard to get the depth of somebody's argument out of these short form, minute-long Instagram videos or an Instagram caption or something like that. Somebody actually tagged all of us in a post that Cal Dietz made yesterday.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking of.
Yeah, he's I believe the head strength coach for University of Minnesota. So obviously prestigious strength coach, probably knows some stuff about some stuff. But he posted a video that said, or it was basically a why you shouldn't actively brace your core video, which is obviously opposite of pretty much everything we've spent our time teaching. And everybody's instinct and gut reaction to that would be to tell him he's wrong and why he's wrong. And if you look at the video, you can kind of get a glimpse into what he's saying, but you really have to try to give him the benefit of the doubt. He's not just saying you should be loose through your core while you lift. He uses kind of a weird example to demonstrate that you're going to be stronger if you're not thinking about keeping your abs tight. But there's no context to the person knowing how to brace. He just says, brace your core really hard, and then does this little demonstration. But there's no actual teaching of it. And I think his argument, at least I'm assuming, is that in an athletic setting, you shouldn't have to be very actively thinking about bracing your core super hard, especially like in a football setting. You should just be doing, playing the sport and moving fluidly and kind of, I was going to say thoughtlessly, but intuitively,
I would say instinctually for sure.
There we go. Yeah, that was the word I was trying to find.
Yeah, I definitely felt the same way from that. I actually wrote up a handful of responses and then deleted them. Not that I had already posted, but just working through my own thought process there. With those kind of things, when something seems so like clickbaity like that, not that that was the intention of that, but when we see that, it's usually have to look past the words and look what the intention of the words were, not just the words themselves. And and when you do that with that, you can kind of see where it's coming from. And I would, I don't know how much we want to really get into this, but the discussion was exactly as Brady said. Like, you don't want to be focusing on keeping a very strong brace like while you're sprinting and jumping in. For us, we're like, yeah, we completely agree with that. Like, there's probably, we have a whole section in our seminar where we're like, hey, don't focus a cue on a specific muscle, which is basically what he's saying.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of stuff like that too, that as a coach, your goal a lot of the time is to keep athletes from letting the pendulum swing too far in one direction or the other from whatever they're talking about. Right. So, my first impulse, kind of like you guys said, if I were to see that Cal Dietz post where he's predominantly focusing on strength and conditioning for, sport specific athletes like hockey or what have you, that his goal is to prepare them to move athletically in a sport setting. Right. And so he probably sees strength coaches in the weight room. You guys have probably seen this too for, strength and conditioning, where they're just, the only cue they have is like, stay tight. Right, they're just like screaming at everyone, like, stay tight, tighten up, stay tight. And it's just like this sort of nonsensical cue that no one really knows what it actually means. And they're training people to, like you said, Brady, to move athletically, like in a field where they have to sprint and change direction. And that, just hammering these folks on stay tight all the time is like maybe not necessarily the thing that they actually want to be doing, right? And so he may be reacting to that specific misapplication of a cue and then make a video, which then, can get misinterpreted as like, do not stay tight in the sport of powerlifting, which is like a completely different thing than, like, don't just scream stay tight at people in your hockey strength and conditioning program, because that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. Collegiate and I guess high school, really every kind of strength conditioning is very interesting in that way, just in the situations that they're forced to work within. You're dealing with large groups of people and you're not working one-on-one with people almost all the time. You're working super long days, super long hours constantly, and just trying to do the best that you can within that window. So there isn't a lot of time for super individualized working on somebody's ability to create intra-abdominal pressure. And how much benefit are you going to derive out of that, depending on the individual too, right? Like, if the person's got flexion-sensitive back pain, you might have a lot more reason to really reel that in and start to work on that. But in terms of just improving their general athleticism, that might not be the best strategy for everybody.
It does seem like a lot of that stuff is more cultural than anything.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily what that individual thinks, and it could definitely be, but I have to think like cues like that are kind of like a bad family heirloom that, your great grandma had this old doll that's really creepy, but you kind of passed it down because it was hers. And now you're forced to stare at it every day and you hate yourself for it. That's kind of what I think about the cues in those settings. It's like, this is how we did it back when I did it, or this is, what I've heard my predecessors scream. So that's the best way that I can liken cues, or in general practices for that matter.
Yeah.
The creepy doll hanging on the wall. Perfect.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect example of
that is the chest up cue.
Yeah, exactly. Stay tight, arch, chest up. Just got these.
It's kind of like, we don't really know why we're saying it, but 10 years down the road, it's kind of still there. Yeah. I guess we'll keep it because we've had it for this long. So
yeah,
why?
Seems to drive a lot of dysfunction too. I've worked with quite a few different college athletes that moved poorly not because they are unathletic, but because they were cued into some dysfunction with stuff like that by overdoing that sort of thing.
Yeah, because you have it's the cue itself may make sense for some individuals in terms of like whatever chest up or arch or heels or whatever, but then you have the 30% of the group who is already back on their heels, who is already hyperlordotic and arched and already kind of like puts their scaps in a weird position to keep their chest up, and then they're just like cranking that even further, and you just get insane movement happening.
I worked with an amateur or a semi-pro baseball player a while back, and he had extension-sensitive back pain, and he was working with this guy who was doing all this like super specific multifidi work on him and things like that. And he had been in strength training for a while, and he had some decent strength coaches up there, but he was always getting like the chest up and the arch harder cue, trying to stabilize the spine or whatever. As soon as I taught him how to pressurize and not kick into excessive spinal extension every time he squatted, he had no back pain immediately. And it was just a simple matter of doing that, not training these ultra-specific muscles, just getting them away from their dysfunction a little bit.
Well, I think the biggest misconception with cues, too, is they tend to be people's defaults, when in fact they're actually the very last part of the education and corrective process. We talk about this in our seminar, albeit quickly, but it's, cues are something that we wanted to drive a specific action, but is that even the best way to do it? Like, is there a better way to educate that person on how to move properly without yelling at them while they're trying to perform? And so the biggest thing that we, try and do is not necessarily to give people an exact system for how to communicate with people, but get their own individual gears kind of churning about how can they effectively communicate with people and educate people that aren't simply cues, because that's essentially what a cue is like it's a way to educate or inform or correct something that you see, and usually it's not the best route to go. Mm-hmm. Not that you shouldn't do it, but you should be very deliberate with how you do it, as with anything as a professional coach.
Yeah, and I think that for some coaches too, cueing like that, it just like makes them feel like they're doing something, right? Like it's like here's the action that I can currently take. Like, let me just start like screaming and yelling, because then at least I feel like I'm being active.
Yeah. That's part of the culture of those weight rooms too. Is there's a little bit of hype going on. Everybody's shouting. There's a lot of noise, music, things like that.
Well, we see that in powerlifting too. Oftentimes, when especially your training partners, when they yell the same cue at you every day, it's not necessarily that they might be doing it because they want you to correct it, but they're just almost trying to make noise to support you.
Yeah.
It's their way of saying, come on, you can do it, while saying, do glutes or chest up or whatever. Usually people yell things, and it seems like it's more of a them trying to be supportive rather than them trying to correct, or there's probably a blend of it. But
yeah, somebody once cued Larry Wheels during a deadlift to fight the Grim Reaper. I don't know. Well, honestly, you're supposed to do that, but sweet.
It's just funny. Even our internal staff is susceptible to the cue monster. One of our, the story was one of our co-owners, as Chris was doing his 30-day squat challenge, and during one of the days, because we did it for Special Olympics benefits, Rudy yelled at Chris to do it for the children right as he unracked his squat bar, which obviously really threw him off.
Yeah.
So it's a funny story.
Well, Wu-Tang is for the children, so it makes
there you go.
And the very next week, somebody shouted, or the same person shouted, "Stay tight" or "Brace hard" at him.
Yeah,
he wasn't about to do that anyway.
Right.
So I think that we spent a lot of time kind of talking about breathing and bracing and all that sort of stuff, which as you guys have mentioned, is focus of the seminars you guys run, and you guys are kind of known for that within the powerlifting coaching community. But I think for a lot of people listening, they may not really have a solid idea of like what we're actually talking about here. So I know you guys have done a bunch of the DNS coursework and kind of learned to apply that more specifically to like your sport. So when we're talking about like breathing and bracing, and kind of making fun of the sort of stay tight cue, what are the main things that you guys are looking for people in terms of their strategy with their actual bracing?
Yeah, that's a big question. It seems like it would be simpler than that, but it's bracing is such a nuanced topic that It's really hard to describe. In fact, I had a conversation with a client because I was like, hey, let's just have a phone call so we can talk through some of this theory. And it's just really hard to get it across for individuals who are, maybe who don't have a background in this kind of stuff. But some of the biggest things that I think we've took away from DNS is the idea of proximal stability, creating distal mobility, or basically, moving around a semi-stable trunk, letting your joints do their actual job and moving and don't have your joints compensating for a lack of or stability elsewhere. Really clearly defining the mobility and stability continuum and how their interactions work. Things that we've taken less away, I think, is the actual core of what DNS is, which is so DNS stands for Dynamic Neuromuscular Stability, and it's really the theory behind developmental kinesiology. Developmental kinesiology being your ideal development stages as a child through maturation. So the theory that our nervous system develops in a very specific way to organize our body in a very specific way, because that's how everybody's bodies are designed. So I think we've all kind of taken a little bit less of that into direct practice. Not that it's not useful. It's just, we see higher payoff points. Definitely the breathing and bracing stuff has been huge for us, but we really dive in deeper on some of the things that influence performance a little bit more, so that we think.
Yeah, with the developmental kinesiology stuff, their aim is kind of like you have these very fundamental movement patterns that you develop through as a baby, and a lot of those kind of get degraded over time too. So a lot of it is about restoring your ability to do these very, very basic things so that you can then layer on more complex movement and start to do more athletic movement. So obviously we're mostly dealing with powerlifters and other strength athletes. So as far as movement complexity goes, we're pretty low on the hierarchy there. But the DNS stuff we tend to pull from the most is going to be bracing, and the output that we're kind of looking for from that is spinal stability and good spinal mechanics. A lot of the time, how that's going to play out is just having people, or the output that we're trying to get from it is teaching people to control their spinal positions so that they can use their actual movers, their prime mover joints to do their job.
Yeah, if I was working as like a practitioner, chiropractor, physical therapist, whatever, I would probably use DNS quite a bit more in terms of the developmental work. But the problem with DNS for our population is it is so nuanced in the movements that if you just saw somebody do it and you tried to do it, you wouldn't do it. There's just no way. There's so many intricate cues and like positions that have to be hit perfectly in order to be like really DNSing. And it's really hard to do that in a virtual setting as we do.
And that's where we were able to derive a lot of benefit from DNS, because that's kind of the foundation of everything else that they're teaching. Is you have to start with this good spinal stability or sagittal stability, as they say, and then you can layer movement on top of that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if you're thinking about whatever coaching an athlete or trying to improve them, let's say specifically in powerlifting from a sport perspective, something else we touched on a little bit is just, I guess, like the hierarchy of priorities for people, right? Like in terms of, where does something like breathing and bracing fit in relative to just like getting a good amount of training in, over time compared to, like nailing some specific assistance work. There's all these things that people could be focusing on. So how do you layer, I guess, these more specific strategies for breathing and bracing and movement patterning in with the other stuff that has to be done during training?
It very much depends on where the person's coming from. I'm going to use a couple of your lifters as examples because you got some strong as shit people. Like Joe Sullivan is a good example of somebody that can brace really well. So we could go down the DNS rabbit hole and work on his bracing forever, and he probably wouldn't get that much benefit out of it. But like when you first started working with Chris Bridgeford, you did quite a bit of that more fundamental bracing and spinal mechanics type stuff, and he benefited quite a bit. So Joe would be more on the end of the spectrum of just needs to train really hard for more time. And Bridgeford obviously needed that too, but he had more of an opportunity to benefit from some of the more fundamental stuff immediately.
Yeah.
And then once he worked through that, it's not like you needed to keep doing that consistently. It was like he just had to learn this stuff, and then you were able to build from there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely. I wouldn't even say it's one or the other focus points. Like, there's probably, I don't think there's any of our athletes on our roster who aren't doing breathing and bracing work in some fashion.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't even mean that you need specific drills for it. Like, you can practice it and once you understand it, you can practice it in any movement. And whether it's actually squatting, whether it's dead bugs, whether it's bird dogs, quadruped work, it doesn't even matter. It really depends on how badly the person needs it. Like, as you mentioned, Todd, you can certainly just train a lot and get stronger, and that'll work. But it's a matter of, like, how well will it work, and am I getting injured? And if those two questions come back of, I could be making more progress, which I don't know anyone who wouldn't want that, / I'm constantly beat up, like, it's a no-brainer to focus on these movement things. And oftentimes, that present themselves as a muscular weakness is often a movement quality issue rather than a muscular weakness. If someone is continually getting stuck at 2/3 up in their squat, but their ankles or their feet are like barely connected to the ground, their toes are kind of fluttering off the ground, certainly we should like train their quads for sure. One of the things that separates us a lot is we look beyond assistance work and look at the person globally more than anything. And for really high level lifters that who haven't been exposed to this, like, we can get huge amounts of payoff from doing these things. The hardest people to get stronger are people who are already strong. So doing things that are not is really, really an effective strategy. Likewise, for novice lifters and people who just getting into it, like, we'll start very basic, not because they don't need it, but because we don't want to overwhelm them. We don't want to make hypochondriacs out of people and make them think that everything's wrong with them. When we're talking about, like, breathing, bracing, feet, ankles, this, that, and the other. So it really depends on the person that you have in front of you. There's no one on our roster, though, that I can think of who isn't doing this stuff. And I think everyone would benefit. It's such a cost-effective thing. I mean, working on your breathing and bracing, it only takes time. It doesn't take additional training resources from a recovery standpoint. So it's like, why wouldn't you do it? The only reason people don't do it is, one, they either don't know that they should be doing it, or they're just lazy and they don't want to take the time to warm up or do the work on their off days.
I'd say it's almost never the case where we're just focused on one or the other. It's always like they're working on those fundamentals and also training and getting stronger.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you mentioned about assistance work is super interesting, right? That we talked earlier about people having very linear and specific explanations for their movement flaws, right? So, like, oh, well, I struggle with, this aspect of my lockout, so, like, it must be my quads, or, like, oh, this knee tends to, kind of roll into this position, so I definitely need, like, more right glute med work, and people will get very specific about which muscles are weak and which muscles are strong and how they need to actually potentially try to improve those, but that a lot of the time it's a more global movement issue. So the problem that you're seeing is a compensation for a bigger issue with an overall strategy for movement, so that the higher return is going to come from cleaning up the entire movement strategy, starting with a breathing and bracing strategy, which can then put other joints in a good position, rather than being super specific of, like, oh, well, this is definitely like a right long head of the tricep issue, so we're going to make sure to do, like, this specific dumbbell exercise or something like that.
Yeah, that's so true. Maybe you would assume your triceps are weak, but if we look at your actual, like, mechanics of your shoulders and your scapula, and we see that it's constantly rolling in on each rep, like, that's a problem. That's the problem right there. It definitely doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing that other stuff, but we need to, be a little bit more accountable to the fundamental movement quality issues that are at play.
Yeah, and I think the real power comes from sort of marrying the two. So not only doing specific tricep exercises or things to target that weakness, but then also not only doing movement and stuff to try and fix it, trying to do both and hit the problem from both sides.
Yeah, and it's not like there's any special corrective exercises or anything like that. All the things that we do can really be done in a normal squat or a normal deadlift. Like, you can practice all of these things. You don't even need correctives for a lot of people.
And how do you coach this stuff in a remote setting, which, like you said, is difficult, right? That in person you can give someone tactile feedback and say, hey, I want you to make sure that you are inflating in your back right here, or that your ribs are moving like this as you're breathing. But remotely, that's much, much more difficult to get people to even do this stuff correctly. So, like, what does that, I guess, prescription or communication process look like for you guys?
Well, for us, I mean, we do have an assessment process. It's painfully simple. We want you to usually squat barefoot with a challenging load. Based on that, and assuming the person has a modern phone that isn't all pixelated, we can tell, reasonably 90% of their issues that are going on. It really comes down to our staff just having a very good eye for movement. We're not the people who, run the FMS type test and we identify that there's one very specific thing that needs to be improved before you can do other things. Like, we look at the athletes in a performance setting. For us, even if it was a team sport athlete, we'd probably have them do the same thing. We'd say, squat to something that's reasonably challenging. There's really nothing that we don't know from watching that. And if you have an eye for movement, and with our athletes, it's less about being prescriptive for them and more about increasing their own awareness about what's going on so that they can correct themselves more often than we have the opportunity to work with them. So if we only have a once a week check-in, we want them working on it every day. So for us, it's about creating awareness of them, like, hey, these things are happening. Stop doing it, or do it better, or whatever the communication strategy is. But for us, it's about creating awareness for our athletes. And like I said, from the assessment process, it's just about having a really refined eye for subtleties in movement, which the subtleties are probably more important than the things that seem more obvious.
Yeah, and what does that process look like then if you let's say have someone filmed on a squat, right? And you're like, okay, cool. Like, we definitely need to work on this aspect of your squatting, right? It looks like you're having a hard time actually connecting your feet, which is potentially causing upstream problems for you in terms of like your hip position and the way that you actually, descend into the squat. Then I guess iteratively over time, right? You want to keep checking on that and making sure that you're working on the right thing. So is it just a continued aspect of having them refilm and resubmit these specific assessment protocols, or how do you guys handle that?
Squat was the specific assessment in that example. So it's really just, the person continues to film their lifts, which is good practice anyways, and they can start to kind of self-regulate as well, within the week or within the month, whatever their check-in time frame is, and then continue to send in more squat footage and just observe it and see how it changes over time. And obviously, if we're not seeing any change, we have other strategies to go to and different ways of phrasing things, different drills people can do, just different ways to try and correct the same sort of issue.
Yeah, I definitely agree. The squat really for us is a very powerful assessment, and it's also a very powerful corrective when done properly. But what it looks like for us, we'll get our, from a process standpoint, we'll get our athletes training videos. Hopefully they filmed it with their entire body where we can see their feet, we can see their ankles, we can see their torso, and we can see the load, everything. And then from that, we'll work through our priorities. And for us, it's making sure that we're not chasing things that are so far outside of our priorities that we, if we start chasing everything that's, on the edges of what our priorities would be, which our priorities are in order, are breathing, bracing, spinal mechanics, feet, hips and shoulders. So hips and shoulders are at the very end. We want to make sure we have our fundamental priorities down first. And then we start delving into, some of the specifics of if we need mobility or whatever in specific places. And oftentimes it's not even a need to do it. It's more about finding a way to be effective with that individual. Some people just can't grasp the idea of breathing and bracing under load, and they don't really know what's going on with their feet. So communicating with them like, okay, let's do maybe a more traditional prep drill for you, and then slowly work through nuances with that. But I'll have clients that if they really can't get it down, I'll even request them to send me bracing videos of them just sitting on a bench. I'll say, hey, take your shirt off and brace like you would if you were squatting heavy. And from there, that can be really powerful, because we can really watch some of the nuance in their tissues and movement qualities. So yeah, for us, it's just a constant back and forth. The worst thing that will happen is that people get in the habit of sending videos in. If they get in the habit of doing it, then the feedback you give becomes less effective. So if someone sends in the same video every week and it has the exact same problem every week, it doesn't necessarily mean that your strategy as a coach is incorrect. It just means that they're not receiving it and they're not putting it into practice. That the feedback from us is really only a starting point for them. They have to go and really try to improve on these things. And it's really not like it's usually not as they're missing a specific exercise. It's like they physically do not try hard enough to change these things. And that might sound like kind of a cop out, but it's more often than not, it's true.
Yeah, I mean, it's like your role as a coach is only to facilitate that individual making progress on their own, right? That like you can't make them take the time to really focus on the different feeling of breathing a certain way versus not breathing a certain way. You can't make them try to figure out how to actually apply what they're learning in, let's say like a dead bug exercise that you give them to their actual deadlift. That those are gaps that are difficult to, transcend, but the responsibility is on that specific individual to like take the time and treat stuff as actual skill work with full engagement from them to learn it, rather than just like, oh, well, here's another thing I can, check off my 10-point checklist for today. And so I did everything. Why am I not getting better? And it's like, no, it's on you. You have to figure it out.
Yeah, treating movement as skill work has been pretty powerful for us, I think, rather than just correction.
Yeah. I think, too, part of it is just people being more educated over time, too, because you'll get people that need to tell you about every single thing they ever feel like, oh, I felt something in my knee. Should we change anything this week? If it's the first time you don't really need to address it. Then on the opposite end of the spectrum, you'll get people that like their knees have been hurting for the last 8 weeks and they never said anything about it, and all of a sudden they've got like a big debilitating problem and they can't squat, but there was never any time to intervene because they never said anything about it. So having a proper amount of communication is very important, and knowing which issues are actual issues are also very important. And that's something that just kind of gets developed in an athlete over time, I think.
Yeah, that's something that, teaching that intuitive sense of like what's okay and what's not okay is super, super difficult. And that, plenty of people, specifically with sport backgrounds from my anecdotal experience, I would say that actually like dance and rugby are the two most insane sports for people like disconnecting properly from pain signals, where it's just like, no, I'm good. It's like, no, you're not good. You like literally tore your hamstring. And just because that you're used to like stretching before like a dance recital, like doesn't mean that it's okay to try to like keep doing CrossFit with a torn hamstring. Like, you crazy person, don't do that. And that the opposite end of the spectrum is just as common with people who are just become so anxious and super sensitive to feedback, and they can't parse out like, like this is just like general discomfort that comes from doing something hard versus this is something that's going to be potentially injurious or like actually limit my training over time. So how do you try to teach people what those differences are in terms of the feelings from their body?
Yeah, for me, it really just comes back to awareness and trying to talk to them in their own language. So you can't be like, even things as simple for us as coaches or professionals will say something like anterior pelvic tilt, and it's something that's so common in the industry that we kind of neglect the fact that some people don't really know what you're talking about, and they'll kind of just go along with it so they don't appear to be uneducated in the manner. So for us, it's figuring out how to speak their language to them and find a way to create that specific awareness around the issue. Sometimes it's just painfully simple the way that we talk to people, which it doesn't mean they're dumb or anything at all. It just means like, it's just the way that's effective for them. Maybe they haven't had a former interest in improving movement, and this is their first, endeavor in it. We often assume that our athletes know things, and in fact they don't. So, talking to them in ways that make sense is really, really important.
Yeah, so much of your job as a coach is also just as an educator, because anterior pelvic tilt is a really good example. I've had 2 different clients now where I've used that phrase, and I'll give them some stuff to work on, but obviously they want to do everything they can, so they'll do a little Google search on anterior pelvic tilt, and suddenly they've got a library of different stuff they think is wrong, and their quads are driving in, and it's this, and it's that, and really it was just a matter of doing the stuff to learn how to control their pelvic position. But once they start going down that rabbit hole, if they're not as educated and they didn't get the problem framed appropriately, they might think they have this crazy pathology that they need to start doing all this different stuff to fix.
Yeah, they're like, oh, great, my breathing, bracing, spinal mechanics stuff, great. I really want to do that now. Give me a stretch for my hip flexor.
Yeah.
Controlling my I'm like, no, don't let me lose you.
Yeah.
So
close.
Building understanding over time.
Yeah.
So you guys also are big proponents of autoregulation in training, right? So essentially, rather than giving people like specific percentages to hit on their lifts, allowing them to go based more on feel within a specific session. Which is, sort of like the stuff we were just talking about. That's difficult for people to actually learn how to do properly. So I guess what do you do to teach people how to properly put forth the right amount of effort on a specific day? And how do you see that, improving people over time as they learn that?
That's a good question. It really depends on the skill set of the individual. From a very basic level, a beginner. So we'll kind of scale this, but a beginner lifter, someone who's new to lifting, I probably wouldn't auto-regulate really anything. I would do that for them. It's training can be a little bit more predictable at that point, and then we can introduce those concepts when necessary. Intermediate guys, it really depends on what they've had experience with if they're coming to you. If they've had zero experience, I'll often put something out there that, again, is meant to create an awareness. So instead of using an RPE, for example, to regulate load, they'll just record it to get a feeling for how hard they thought it was. And then for advanced lifters, it really comes down to personality. You can't give a subjective indicator like an RPE to someone who's hyper aggressive in the weight room. Those individuals tend to favor objective measures such as velocity or things along those lines. But it is tough for sure. But it really comes down to the systems you have in place. There's no one perfect autoregulation method. There's no one ideal fit for anybody. And in fact, I often find myself going the route of more freedom than less freedom in my training. When I first started out as a coach, everything was hyper controlled, and I had the big grandiose plan for each person, and I had a very specific way I wanted them to do it. And deviation from that would mean a total replanning of everything on my end. What I've done over time is slowly shift to a little bit more freedom, and that'll come in the form of load ranges instead of a specific percentage, or an RPE range rather than a specific RPE. And it's different for each lifter. If we have someone who's not familiar with RPEs and we start assigning specific RPEs to them, they'll inevitably be a learning curve to that. So it really comes down to the individual, as a lot of these things do, in finding kind of where they're at, and really, in my opinion, using autoregulation as little as possible. If you can predict training to a certain extent, that's I believe ideal. Obviously, the extent is not huge, but in the initial couple weeks of every block, you probably don't need to autoregulate because of the unless that's one of the main components of your program. But usually, training can be a little more predictable in that setting.
Yeah, I think that the idea surrounding, being very specific when you're, starting out as a coach, and then over time, kind of loosening up a little bit, is super, super common, right? That, you read books and you see programs and you're like, okay, here's the formula. I found the secret. We're going to do, this percentage wave loading over this amount of time. And you're just going to end up setting a 10 kilo PR. That's just how the numbers work. And then, as you coach people for a while, you realize that real life is way more chaotic and messy. So then you're always kind of trying to find this right balance between how much freedom you give people and how specific you are with what they do. And that a lot of coaches start very specific, then open it up, and then kind of start bouncing back and forth between the two.
Yeah. Not only is real life more chaotic, and most of our athletes are not professional powerlifters. In fact, probably only 3 of them are, if that's even a thing. But really, I don't.
You get some free protein on Instagram just so you're a professional.
Right. Yeah, I don't even think that adaptation is that specific. Like in terms of how we view it as powerlifters, I don't know that there's a huge difference between 80% and 84% of your training max. So use something within that range. So yeah, there's so many ways to do it. We definitely are not the guys who promote only using velocity or only using RPEs or only percentages. It's like there's definite blend. It comes down to the personality of the individual, their skill set with it, and how much intervention you want those optimization routes to have. Because there's certain points in the training process where training should be hard, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you should auto-regulate it. It just means that that's the intent of the current training. So you have to kind of be a fairly deliberate with how you're using it, and making sure that you're not revolving everything around just the implementation of one variable.
Yeah, and there's also, value, I think, in sometimes giving people something pretty specific to hit, just so you as a coach can see what happens, and then also that they as an athlete can see what happens based upon that, right? That you're trying to create a scenario for them to learn. And sometimes learning can come from being given a pretty broad range of like, hey, you're going to build to, let's say, a tough set of 3 for today. So let's call that like an 8.5 on a RPE scale, right, out of 10. And so there's learning for that individual and like what actually is an 8.5 out of 10 for them. And then sometimes there's learning in, the weightlifting coach at my gym, he was prescribed to hit a 170 clean and jerk yesterday and Friday, which for him is higher than his current 1 rep max. So his coach is like, you know what, I think you can do this. So you're going to put this on the bar and you're going to see what happens. So, on both ends of the spectrum, from like pretty free, like feel something out for today versus like literally hit this exact weight, that both of those create environments for the athlete to actually learn where they're at a given time.
Yeah, there's so many ways to do it. I think the one way to take away the privilege of using autoregulation is for those individuals who don't try as hard as they can. If effort isn't put forward, you'll just stay in one place. If I have someone using RPEs and their loads just aren't going up in a reasonable time frame, and it doesn't have to be weekly. If they're not going up over a month, and it's not just the specific template, like this is something they've done in the past, then I'll take RPs out and start structuring their loads for them. And then maybe we'll come back to them or use RPs in assistance work or something. But there's so many ways to do it. It comes down to how you can rationalize it as a coach and how you can fit it into your specific process of thinking, I think.
And I think weightlifting is a little bit different too, because it's a lot less taxing to just Clark a clean than it is to grind
Clark?
it. You never heard that before? Oh, you just like pull it and don't even try to get under.
That's weird.
So like just grossly missing clean versus like grinding out an 8-second squat. The squat's going to take a lot more out of you from a recovery standpoint, so it's a little more important to hit those numbers within the correct level of exertion that you're looking for. And then just weightlifting being a little more able to be trained a little more frequently in general too.
Yeah, and weightlifting probably has a little bit more fluctuation on a daily basis in terms of what you can and should be able to hit and how it feels, right?
Yeah.
That some days you're feeling snappy and you can just like hit heavy singles on everything and feel awesome, and other days it's like it's a struggle to hit 90%, which is going to happen in powerlifting as well. But I think that daily fluctuation, at least from sort of like an intuitive and anecdotal perspective, is a little more variable in weightlifting. So giving people more wiggle room can be helpful there, since they are going to have a lot of variation in terms of like what starts to happen to them with those heavier lifts. So something else I was interested in for you guys is that you have multiple things kind of going on within Kabuki, right? I mean, you have the coaching, you have the actual like seminars for primarily coaches, although I think athletes take them as well, and you have the actual equipment that you guys manufacture. So with all of that, I mean, there's a lot of different angles you guys can go as far as creating different content. And there's also the constant battle between, putting stuff out there that creates engagement and is exciting for people and that they like it, and it's just like big lifts and, people getting super pumped up. But then there's also the stuff that's potentially more valuable with some more dense theoretical discussions or trying to explain why certain things matter and all that sort of stuff. So how do you guys actually balance what you're putting out there in terms of like what you want to resonate with people and how much you want to try to pull people down the rabbit hole into more technical information?
Yeah, it's really up to that individual, I think. We definitely won't stop posting bigger lifts just because we want people to be more focused on educating themselves. Like some people just aren't going to put the effort out to educate themselves. So we want to have the resources available for those individuals who do want that. But we also want to celebrate the lifters that we have. And that's more or less, why we post them is to be like, hey, this guy's kicking ass. It is kind of to walk the walk in a sense and not just talk the talk. So not only do we have, these, what we think are some really, really great educational resources, but like, hey, here's people putting this stuff into practice and look at what they're doing. So for us, I don't even know that we ever even think about balancing it. I mean, we certainly don't want to be the company that's, following popular fitness trends and doing, popular trendy type stuff like these lifestyle brands and things like that. We're definitely not going to do that. There just isn't really a purpose, and it seems it's just not us. But from posting like big lifts and all that stuff, like we want to do that to celebrate our people, but to also show like, hey, this stuff that we're doing works. But we'll also have more extensive resources available for those who want to go down that rabbit hole or who want to challenge themselves or who want to improve. So yeah, and any time that we post stuff publicly, we kind of understand that we're posting it publicly. So it's usually not our most dense stuff, and we've learned that through experience. I mean, we posted a photo of like what a foot looks like when it's properly rooted and the toes have a nice spread versus a foot that was fairly inactive and not stable, and people didn't really know how to take it because it was so abstract to them. Mm-hmm. So when we post stuff publicly, we understand that we're talking to the general audience. So we'll post things that are a little bit less, not necessarily less specific, but less nuanced, and they don't have to have a big they don't have to have a background in this stuff, or they don't have to be exposed to it prior to understand it. So we'll instead of posting like really nuanced things on like the diaphragm and eccentrically loading the muscular sheath in the space between the hips and rib cage, we'll talk about here's a few ways to improve your sumo deadlift position. So very simple things, and if people want to pursue it from there, they can. But we try not to post a ton of nuanced stuff right out of the gate because people just don't really know how to receive it.
Just from a general content creation standpoint, our criteria tends to be stuff that we use, stuff that we're finding interesting, stuff that is going to help people in some capacity.
Yeah, I also think it's interesting that you guys said you learned from experience, right? That maybe previously you're putting out more like detailed or complex stuff and finding that it potentially lacked. Well, I mean, were you just looking at amount of shares or something like that, and we're just like, oh, this is maybe not. This is a little too heavy for people.
It's engagement and
just the discussion that precedes it.
The discussion in the comments usually drives us quite a bit. We try and meet people, but if they don't understand it, it's really hard to have those discussions. And that's why I very seldom respond to clients over Instagram or Facebook. It's so hard to communicate in those short windows that like, hey, let's communicate via email or via Skype or via phone because you're just not going to get the complete picture. And it's the same when we post things like the foot one was a good example. There's I'm trying to think of other ones we've done. We've gotten better at it in understanding how, what people can receive. But yeah, we kind of have to find that balance of how do we talk to that. How do we talk to the general audience? Obviously we want to promote what we do, and the things that drive us the most are not the things like improving your sumo position. For us, it's understanding more and more the intricacies of movement, being able to coach it better. But those things aren't always, there's even when we post things like ask us a question, they're questions that we would find so painfully simple. Or they're not even properly formed. So those, it's usually, it's just hard to talk to the general audience about completely nuanced and specific things, I think.
Especially in short form content. Instagram just dropped this ask a question feature, and so we did that on the virtual coaching account, and the answer to almost every question everybody asked was inevitably it depends, because it was a one sentence question that you couldn't gather any context from.
Yeah, kind of back to where we started. One of the question we always get in every medium is, what do you think about conjugate? And it makes me want to blow my freaking head off. You just can't have that discussion. Like it's something that, people are they hold it like the sacred cow of strength training. And it's like, well, yeah, but we have to figure out, number one, what do you even think that word means?
Yep.
Like what you think it means might not be what it actually is. Like it might mean something else. So we have to meet them where they're at. Like if someone's like, what do you think about conjugate versus 5x5? And I'm like, I don't want to talk to you. Like it's not because it's not they're trying to figure things out, but you gotta, it's just not something that because it depends. It's like, okay, if we break down what the word conjugate means from a training standpoint, we're talking like, lots of variation, frequent heavy lifts, probably lower volume. And so in that sense, breaking it down like that, we'll say, hey, in these situations, certain people might benefit from this type of thing, but it doesn't mean that conjugate's better or worse than this thing. It's like we just can't have that discussion. Until we really have the other person like know what they're asking.
And there's so much nuance to it too, because getting coached conjugate by Louis Simmons is probably very different than getting coached conjugate by Joe Blow at your local powerlifting gym. And the answer to what our thoughts are on that kind of thing is going to be completely different based on what it actually is for that person.
Yeah, it's just like, and it's how you apply it too. Like some people think conjugate means speed work with 40%, 48 hours before your max effort work that shouldn't be 72 hours in between sessions. And other people, think that speed work is like much heavier. So it's like, what are you even asking? Like there's just, it's, we can definitely, talk about it, but anytime that we answer such generalized questions, we have to give a general answer, and it's usually not that helpful. So I think the best thing that people can do is understand what they're asking first. Not necessarily these ultra simple questions. Mm-hmm. It's not that we have to have a very specific question to provide a good answer, but there's things like that just have so much. There's so many different ideas swirling around it that it's tough to talk about.
And to give a simple answer to a complex question like that, I think is a disservice to the person asking the question, because there's plenty of people out there that would be happy to just say, oh, conjugate sucks, or conjugate is the best program ever. And that doesn't help the person move forward at all. It doesn't give them any education on the subject.
Yeah, even if we told them that, we don't think it's that good, like, what does that even mean for them when they hear that? Like, what's a solution then? So it is tough. And so things like that we viewed from the audience that we're in, in the corner of the fitness industry that we're in with strength sports, we do have to be somewhat selective of, what we put out there for, in the public domain.
Yeah, and I think that, like you guys have been saying, your role as an expert is to kind of try to filter what people are actually asking and then help them upgrade the question that they're asking, right? Or you're going to get questions that are, quite frankly, stupid questions where you're like, well, that doesn't make any sense because the entire premise based upon which you're asking this question is flawed, which is why you don't know what you're doing, which is why you're coming to me, the expert, to try to help you. So it's this weird balance between trying to take the question that someone is giving you that they'll actually be interested in and then like leave enough breadcrumbs for them to figure out, a more nuanced or detailed understanding so that they can then in turn ask a better question.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I would definitely never condemn someone for asking a what I would consider a dumb question. My role at that point is less in answering it and more in guiding their thought process on how to ask it again, and not even that it's I don't want to sound pretentious with all this stuff because that's definitely not where I'm coming from. But as a professional in this field, we have more of a role to guide those individuals from that starting point rather than to provide them with an answer. And I think that's how I try to approach those. What I would consider dumb. I don't even want to
simple questions.
Simple. Yeah. I don't want to use the word dumb, but just very simple questions that don't have much to chew on. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Or potentially. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, hopefully that person is asking it from a place of wanting to learn more about the topic and not just a place of give me an answer to, because there really never is just an answer for it.
Yeah.
And the person has to want to start to think for themselves on the topic and learn more of the meat of the question, I guess.
And a lot of those people, they'll ask that exact same question to anyone that has an open ear.
Yeah.
So it's,
half the time it's them looking for validation in what they're already doing.
Yeah, they're not even looking for. Yeah, that's exactly right. So in those situations, like I said, I try and just guide people a little bit more and like kind of walk that route with them rather than providing an ultra detailed answer on yes or no. So, yeah. And there's certainly times where we'll get really good questions and, we have fun with it and we can challenge ourselves when we answer them. Question and answer stuff is really good for us because it forces us to validate what we're saying. And if we can't type it out and, put our stamp on it, then it's probably something we should reconsider. But, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that something else that will happen with people too is they'll ask a question that's several steps down a chain of events that may or may not actually be correct. I mean, you mentioned hip flexor stretches earlier, right? So someone will be like, "What's a good hip flexor stretch?" And you're like, "Well, why do you want to know?" And they're like, "Oh, well, when I squat, like I feel my hip pinching." And you're like, "Okay, well, maybe we do something other than stretch your hip flexor, right? Maybe your squat stance is screwed up. Maybe you don't brace properly. Maybe you're doing way too much volume of this type of movement. So, these muscles are overworked and are irritated when you squat." So it's also an ability to kind of like try to figure out where is this question coming from? Like, why are you actually asking this? And, do we maybe need to take a few steps back on that path that you've already, started to sprint down on your own?
Yeah, and unfortunately that takes a lot more deep diving and essentially some coaching in that way. And a lot of the times people just want an answer. They want a drill they can go do that is supposed to fix their problem, which is just almost never the way the world works.
Yeah, and even if someone asks, if one of our clients asks what's the best hip flexor stretch, we could obviously give them a hip flexor stretch, but that would, in my opinion, be a disservice. We kind of have to challenge them on, like you said, why they're doing it. Not because we don't want them doing it, but we want them to have a deeper understanding of some of these things. I mean, that's what, especially for our coaching service being a little bit more expensive, like we really want people to get the most out of it. So, not just providing, a simple couch stretch or something like that. Like, okay, let's dive a little bit deeper. Let's see why you even need to do a stretch, because the reason you need to do a stretch probably doesn't necessitate doing a stretch. It might be something else. So it kind of goes back to our initial discussion, talking about Cal Dietz and that stuff. Like, probably a great guy. I don't know a ton about him, but you have to kind of see where they're coming from with the statements, and you can't just be, you can't be the guy who tries to call him out because he missteps on one word. Like, okay, you know where he's coming from, and approach from that point, not from the, you're stupid and here's why point.
Yeah, definitely. And I would recommend checking out the Triphasic Training book that he wrote. it's pretty interesting stuff. I've tried some of it, and I wouldn't consider it necessarily directly applicable to like what I'm doing with CrossFit athletes, but there's some good ideas there surrounding, I mean, essentially a lot of different like types of loading and training, and like focusing on eccentric for certain phases of a cycle, and then concentric for certain phases of a cycle, and isometric for certain phases of a cycle, and it's actually pretty cool stuff. So we'll give Cal Dietz some positive feedback there too.
We definitely don't want to appear negative at all.
Yeah.
In fact, we had him on our podcast a couple months ago, and it was a great discussion around all of these things. And from that discussion, like, we have a lot of similarities with him, as we do a lot of people who are doing well in their craft. And I even think that, even if you seek out a resource, it doesn't even have to be like the golden thing. Like, it can just be there to challenge your own belief structure. Like, you don't always need to search out the ultra scientific stuff. You can look from people who are actually doing it. And, there's so many ways. There's so many ways to learn and to gain resources for yourself as a coach. And it's almost less about the source and more about, what you can extract from that source. So
there you go. Words of wisdom. All right, guys. So Kabuki Strength, tell me about it. We got coaching, we got seminars, we got equipment. What's the deal?
Yeah, all that.
So you can check out KabukiStrength.com. There should be a link to the store there. There should be a link to coaching, seminars, everything's on there. Yeah, definitely check us out. At KS_virtual coaching on Instagram.
Yep.
At Brandon_Senn on Instagram. Brady_Cable on Instagram. Check us all out. Follow all of us.
Yeah, give us your follows. Give us all your attention. Yeah. We really feel like we're in a unique spot in the industry that we're pretty proud of. We're not just an equipment company. We're not just a coaching company. We're trying to provide global solutions for individuals. If we find something that will benefit them and it's within our scope to affect, like, we'll create it. Mm-hmm. It's what we've done with everything from our barbells to our the systems that we use for coaching, and the resources that we provide on our video library and forum. So we're pretty pumped for what the future looks like for us.
Yeah, and I would say that as someone who personally enjoys the denser content, the YouTube channel, and going back in the archives, there's some pretty excellent stuff.
There's definitely some gems in those relics for sure.
Thanks for listening all the way through. I admire your grit, your persistence, and your perseverance. Since you made it, I have a few favors to ask of you. Go ahead and open up the show notes on whatever podcast player you use. In there, you'll find links to all the resources that were mentioned throughout the show. There's also some links there in which you can leave a review or subscribe to the show. And podcasters are always harping on this because this actually makes a difference in terms of the algorithms that recommend podcasts to new people. So if you do that, it helps more people find the show. And if you head over to toddneef.com, you can sign up to receive most of my thoughts and writing, which really only go out to the email list. A lot of it never makes it to the blog or the podcast. So if you like what I have to say and you want to see some of my recommendations and stuff that I've been checking out, go ahead and subscribe to that email newsletter as well.